Dad, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Bill Keeler. I would be Kelsey's father.
Cool. All right. The first question we're going to ask you is about your education.
How far back do you want to go?
To high school.
Oh, I wanted to go further.
No. If you want to
You
go
wanna-
further, that's
I want to
fine.
hear about first and second grade in Bermuda,
Wow.
or
Yes.
going to school then in Texas and then graduating from Santa Barbara School in Dedido, Guam into 8th grade. So, but high school, I went 4 years to the same high school because my dad was in the service. That was unusual. My sister Ann went to 3 schools. In New Jersey at a public school that was off the Air Force Base, so it was mostly Air Force kids and local farm kids. Northern Burlington County Regional Junior Senior High School.
Wow.
Graduated in 1966.
What was your fondest memory from school growing up as an Army brat,
I was an Air Force brat.
an Air Force brat?
Okay. I think my fondest memory was actually traveling with my family. So wherever we were stationed when we were in the States, for example, if we were going to go visit our grandparents, we would all climb into the back of a station wagon and off we'd go. So they were in upstate New York. Driving from Texas to upstate New York would take a while. We'd stop early in the afternoon at a motel that had a pool, and it was almost always the summer. So that was fun. Traveling from Texas to California to then fly on to Guam. That was another great trip. So I think my fondest memories were these journeys with all of us in a car.
Awesome. And then what about college? If you could travel back in time, what would be one piece of advice that you'd give yourself going back to college?
Going back to college, I think I would have worked harder my first year. I did not, like a lot of college students, make the transition all that well from high school to college, particularly since high school was pretty easy and college wasn't. But from then on, my last 3 years in college, I was able to manage having a good time and doing social things and still studying.
Do you have a fondest memory from college? Maybe, I don't know, injuries, funny injury stories, or funny stories from college?
So, I think for a lot of college students, they like going to concerts. And I had gone to almost no concerts when I was in high school. And I showed up as a freshman at a college that was all boys at the time. It was at Notre Dame. And the guys in the dorm one Saturday were saying, okay, we're going over to Steppen Center, which was this big auditorium, and we're going to go to a concert. Okay, so I went to this concert. It was dirt cheap because it was a college concert, and thought the music was outstanding, spectacular, had never heard anything like it, and still remember asking some of the guys in my dorm were from Chicago, so who are these people? Well, the first group was the Four Tops, and the next group was the Temps. how do you just stumble across the Four Tops and the Temps at their peak for your first concert? And from then on, I mean, it was just because of where we were located, could always have great Motown groups showing up.
That's awesome.
So that was a good memory.
Can you tell the story about when you hurt your arm and you were racing with your friend? Can you tell that story?
Yeah, I can kind of. So at that time, Notre Dame's no longer this way. That when you end up in a hall, you're there for usually for your entire 4 years. But in those days, there was what they called a freshman quad, which was where the freshmen and the sophomores were. So my freshman dorm was right next to the dorm that I ended up as a sophomore, but the freshman dorm was fairly new. But the sophomore dorm was called Zom, and after Father Zom, who was one of the Holy Cross priests who I guess showed up with Father Soren back in the mid-1800s and helped found Notre Dame. And because it was in the Midwest, they have kind of two sets of doors everywhere. So there's one door that you come into, and then there's an entryway, and then you go into the regular part of the dorm or the library or whatever, and that's just to help keep the cold out. And they continue that all the way up the stairs, so that when you're in the stairwell, there's a separate set of doors, and they're swinging doors into the hallway itself. So, and these doors are old, and like I say, they're swinging, and they have a set of window panes that are held in place with just wood, because they're wooden doors. So Jimmy Urban and I had been friends since we were freshmen, and trying to be walk-on athletes. And Jimmy Urban thought that he was the fastest kid in the dorm, and I thought I was the fastest kid in the dorm, so you gotta have a race. So we set up this sprint down a hallway that was a pretty long hallway, 40, 50 feet. And I beat Jimmy Urban off the start and was starting to slow down because I was getting near the stairwell. When out of the corner of my eye, I saw Jimmy Urban was catching up to me. So I was accelerating as I got to the stairwell. And instead of hitting the panel to open the door, I hit the middle of one of those four things that were holding some panes of glass. Broke all the glass, of course, and ended up swinging on the door on my arm. And of course, had a giant piece of glass sitting in my arm. But barely won the race. And I thought I was entitled to some congratulations, but no, the rector for that dorm heard all the commotion and came up and saw all the blood and everything, so took me and my partner in crime, Jimmy Urban, to the local hospital, which the ER room at that point was being staffed by young girls from the nurses' college. So again, I got in trouble with the rector because I thought it was fun to kind of like squeeze my arm and blood would. I was trying to catch the student nurses.
It's really funny. Good story. Awesome. What did you do after college? I know that you studied history.
Well, I studied history in college, and then because my parents
had met in law school, and then there weren't a whole lot of women in law school in the 40s. I knew I was going to be a lawyer, so when I got out of college, I applied to a bunch of law schools and ended up going to law school on the West Coast, and spent 3 years, typical tour of law school, and then took the bar, and then went into the military because I'd been commissioned. I'd been in ROTC in college, so I'd been commissioned when I graduated from college, and they just gave me a delay to go to law school. And then law school was out and the bar exam was over. I went on active duty for 4 years as a Air Force lawyer.
Oh, that's awesome. What do you think were major differences between your education and your parents' education?
I know more about my dad's education just because he was a bit of a storyteller. I know that my mom was a pretty serious student, but I mostly know about her in law school. And what I know of my father is that he was the youngest in his family. He had older brothers and a sister. And so he actually wanted to go away to college. So he left upstate New York, they lived in Buffalo, and went to Washington and Lee, which is a college in the South.
I think I had spoken about not knowing as much about my mom and her education, other than because her dad was a captain on the Great Lakes. She knew more about navigation than anybody I've run into since. So my dad left upstate New York, being the youngest, wanting to do something different than what his siblings had done. Went to school in the South at Washington and Lee. Still remember him doing their fight song, which he insisted was more famous than either the Michigan or the Notre Dame fight songs. And he had one of his brothers. This was he was going to college during World War II, and one of his brothers had already graduated from college. I don't think he'd gone to law school yet, and gone into the military. And everybody in the Keeler family had been artillery, and his brother had gone into the artillery. So, being a bit of a rebel, my dad went into the Army Air Corps. So he became a pilot, went over to Europe and flew bombers. And then when he came back, in those days, oh, I take that back. He had already moved when he got out of college. He hadn't graduated from college, but you could go into law school without getting your college degree. So he started law school and then went into the military. He'd come home to be near his mom when his brother had gone off to war, and then he goes off to war. So I think he also studied history and obviously all of the typical things that you study when you go to law school, and is rumored to have gone into the law school library once. And that was the one time that my mom, who was a law student there, her and some friends wanted to go to a dance, needed somebody to drive them. My dad had a car, so they Mom went into the law library, and there was my dad. He claimed it was the only time he was ever in the law library, but so he gave him a ride and they went to the dance. So I think that's how my mom and dad met each other. Kind of serendipitous.
That is serendipitous. When did you become a judge advocate general in the Air Force? What was the process like, and when did you?
So
you have to get certified. You have to go to Judge Advocate General School, JAG School. I went on active duty February 28th of 1973 and showed up at the base where I was stationed, which was in California near Sacramento, called it's Travis Air Force Base. It's a big base for transport, for moving stuff. Almost everything that's flying from the Orient, from the East, is coming, from the Far East is coming through Travis. And I'm there for about it must have been about three months, because then I got sent to JAG School, which was in Alabama, which was I'd never been to the South, so that was a kind of a cultural experience. So you spend 6 weeks there learning how, you're already a lawyer, you've already passed a bar somewhere, and so you learn how to be an Air Force lawyer, you learn about the Uniform Code of Military Justice, you learn about their procurement, how the Air Force buys stuff, the contracts that they enter into. You learn about what sort of things would be involved in advising base commanders and that sort of thing. Then we were taken up to Washington, D.C. Obviously the Department of Defense is up there in the Department of the Air Force. We spent, I'm going to say, 3 or 4 days up there, get sworn into the Court of Military Appeals, and plus we get to visit the Supreme Court and all of that kind of stuff. Then go back to Maxwell, get certified, and then when I get back to Travis, I'm a JAG. So that was the process that I went through.
Do you have any stories or fun memories from your experience as a JAG? Anything that you can talk about?
Yeah. First of all, most of what you're doing is pretty public. I mean, even though your client is the government, if you're doing courts martials, they're for the most part somewhat public. So, that's part of what I did, mostly prosecuting. Did a few defense things. I still remember my first client was little Eddie Hearn, who I had to visit him at the base jail because he'd been arrested for some sort of drug offense. And then when we were going to go to his first hearing, he needed to wear his formal blue outfit. So I went to his barracks, and his commanding sergeant let me into his room so I could get his full dress kind of uniform, and wasn't sure whether I was supposed to mention to the sergeant that there was a syringe in the trash can.
Oh no.
Little Eddie Hearn, he ended up being getting into a little bit of trouble. But my favorite case was, so they evaluate pilots and navigators. And if a pilot or a navigator makes a mistake or does something that gets them into trouble, shows up drunk or misses the runway or things like that, then they have a board called a flying evaluation board to determine whether or not they will take them off of flight status, take them off of being qualified. And the very first flying evaluation board I had was, and I was only a captain, was for this major who was a navigator, and they wanted to take away his qualifications to fly. because there'd been an inspector general on a plane that he was on that thought he had misbehaved. So here's what he had done. Air Force cargo planes are cavernous. I mean, they're huge. And like other planes, the bathrooms are at the back of the plane. So he was just deadheading to somewhere. He wasn't the navigator on the plane. He was just picking up a space available flight. And he got up, he goes to the bathroom. And as he comes out of the bathroom, coming at him is a Frisbee. Because there were some airmen on the plane, and you can't imagine how fun it is because the Frisbee, as it's going through the air, the Frisbee doesn't know what the plane is doing, it just knows what gravity is doing. So if a plane is moving up and down, it looks like the Frisbee is doing that too. So I learned this in preparation for the Flying Evaluation Board. One of the great fun things to do, if you can get away with it, is to toss a Frisbee around in one of these giant transport planes. And the navigator, Major, can't remember his name, he knew that. So he comes out of the bathroom and there's a Frisbee coming at him. He grabs it and tosses it back. That's what they were going to take him off of flight status for. Because that's a no-no for a major. I mean, you know, the airman got in enough trouble, but the major was he was in a whole lot of trouble, and some inspector general guy had seen him and thought he ought to be taken off of flying status. So here's how easy it was to defend it. Besides, every single one of the flight officers who were on the Flying Evaluation Board realized this is not a big deal. But here's who my guy was. So the Air Force has, they've got the bombers, that's Strategic Air Command, and they've got different kinds of organizations within the Air Force, and one of them is called, it used to be called Military Airlift Command, that's the transport people, and then it was called Military Transport something or other. He had, for the 2 previous years, been the MAC Navigator of the Year. So he's like the best navigator they've got. And they're going to take him off of flight status, or the Inspector General wants to take him off of flight status because he tossed the Frisbee back. So that was great fun. You kind of, I think any lawyer kind of likes it when you get a case handed to you like that.
Yeah.
Really?
Did he get his flight status taken away?
No. Oh, absolutely not.
Awesome. Good.
Yeah, I got to sit there and listen to, whenever you're in the military and you're being judged, whether it's a crime you're accused of, the jury, or in this case the board, they have to outrank you. It wouldn't be good, you can imagine, if you're a general and there are a bunch of majors that are deciding things for you, because if you don't like it, when you're done, you're still a general, they're still majors. So his Flying Evaluation Board, because he was a major, was all colonels, and these colonels were pretty ticked off that they'd had to spend time dealing with the Frisbee.
Nice.
Anyway.
My next question is, either in the Air Force or in college, did you learn any important lessons, especially in the Air Force when you were a JAG? Did you learn anything important that sticks with you today?
There's a certain value to neatness and to order that I never really appreciated when I was in college or younger. And when you first run into it in the military, and I'm not talking about, making sure that all of the pencils in your desk drawer are lined up correctly. I'm not talking about that. But I'm just talking about doing things a certain way because that's the way they're done. And, even when it comes to the ceremonial things, you're walking down the sidewalk and you salute people. And you do it sharply and crisply because that's the way you're supposed to do it. Well, after you've done that for a while, and after you get the respect from people that you might outrank, but yet you realize that they know a lot more about what they're doing than you might. Or sometimes it works the other way up too, when for the most part, I was advising colonels that had been in the military for 15 or 20 years at a time when I might have been there for 2 or 3 years. But they were respectful, and it just was an attitude about how you do things. This is the way you do them, and you don't question the way you do them. You just do it. And within a short time of being in the military and seeing it done that way, and certainly years later, I just realized that, having that sort of just an attitude towards in the way in which you respect a system and you respect the people in the system, and even when things are going wrong, you rely on the system. It became, to my way of thinking, really important and really valuable. And then it was easy to carry over because that's also in many ways the manner in which the legal system works. You could have trials where, the judge is sitting around with, a t-shirt on and shorts and, sitting at the same level as you, and it just wouldn't work. There's a reason why judges sit higher and wear black robes, and you address them formally, and it allows for the system to work so much better, in my opinion.
Thank you. What is your fondest childhood memory? And you were talking a bit earlier about traveling and...
Yeah, I think that was a fond memory. I think just the overall feeling of family with, there were 5 kids, and I was very fond of being the oldest.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah. It cut both ways, so to speak, because I think parents are typically, certainly mine, were stricter on the oldest, particularly the oldest boy, and then I had 3 sisters before my brother showed up. So, yeah, traveling, being the oldest, being a family, all of that I was pretty fond of that. I was very fond of and really enjoyed the way in which my parents never seemed to think that just because you were a kid, you weren't smart, or you couldn't figure things out, or you couldn't talk about topics that were complicated or involved. It was the sort of thing that we saw regularly, and it wasn't just me. I mean, I had a younger sister who was always quizzing my dad about a class he was taking in metaphysics. We're all pretty sure she was faking it, but she...
Which sister?
Oh, that was Kathy.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
but my dad thought it was pretty good fun that Kathy wanted to actually pay attention when he was telling her about this metaphysics class he was taking.
What sibling were you closest to growing up, or did it change? Yeah, let's get closer.
Okay. I don't think I was any closer to any of them for the longest time because it's every 2 years a sister showed up. So, you know, I mean, to me, they were all the same. You know, I had, when I was just a kid, a toddler, I had a baby sister. And then I was a little older and I had 2 baby sisters. And then I was like a kid and I had 3 baby sisters. You know, so I just, you know, they were a package deal. And there, as you get to be a teenager, you know, spend a whole lot of time with babies. And so when my brother showed up, it, you know, okay, there's a baby. It wasn't until I was actually in high school that he had grown up enough so that it looked like he had a personality, and that you could actually talk about things. And you know, we shared a room from, gosh, for about 10 years. So let's say the last 4 years of that, and then I had a pretty close relationship with my brother.
Wonderful. What was your dad like?
Depended on when, because after I went off to college, he got out of the service and became a civilian lawyer, and was just, you know, that was a completely different kind of life. But for me growing up, while he was in the Air Force, and he was also a lawyer in the Air Force, it was kind of almost the Ward Cleaver kind of a father. I mean, he even though he was in the military, being a military lawyer, you had a regular 8 to 5 job. So he was home. Evenings, he would help with homework. I still remember him grilling me so that I could learn the 7 cardinal virtues. But that was just one memory, but he was, both he and my mom were real good at, you know, working with me on my homework. They were interested in how my day had gone and how my sister's day had gone. We had the kind of life growing up where there wasn't TV, so dinner was, you know, a regular deal. When shortly after my dad got home, we were all sitting around the dinner table, and then we were doing homework. So he was pretty involved. Wasn't, I guess, parents sometimes are now referred to as helicopter parents. He wasn't like that. I mean, he might occasionally go to a sporting event that I was at, but you know, that wasn't, you know, like a huge focus for him. When am I going to be the next star? And of course, it helped that I was never going to be the next star. So, but yeah, he was involved. For me, he was a pretty great dad.
And your mom?
It was almost scary how smart she was. My dad had, his father was a judge, and his 2 older brothers were lawyers, and he was a lawyer, and they all thought that my mom was the smartest lawyer in the family. But kind of an ethereal,
not sure what she would be like in a courtroom, but if you asked her about legal theory or metaphysics, she was just real smart. As far as being a mom, worked, she was a stay-at-home mom and did all of the sorts of things that stay-at-home moms do. Didn't drive us to school because when you're living on a military base, there are buses. You walk out your front door and the school bus would pull up. But when we were home, it was a regular home cooked meal, and it was pretty much the same home cooked meal every Monday and then every Tuesday. I'm sure if I sat down with my sisters, they might not remember what day we had veal cutlets and what day we had ham and scallop potatoes, but they would remember those meals. She was not a spectacular cook. It was just, let's get some food into them. Peanut butter and jelly in the lunchbox. So, but certainly having a mom that smart made you got to enjoy learning.
Was it hard for you to transition as much as you did?
Oh, by that I guess you mean, not going to school with the same kids that you started in kindergarten.
Yeah.
Every few years going to a new school. And as I've grown up, I've heard lots of people ask me that, like it must have been a problem. But if you don't know anything different, you don't see it as a problem. It was actually just normal. I mean, you show up the first day of school and you'd just be saying, so who are the new kids? Because there'd be a bunch. And sometimes you'd show up the first day of school and you're one of the new kids. So you just expected that, and it was the norm. It wasn't until I was older that I kind of would scratch my head and say, I wonder what it would be like if I'd gone to school with the same kids all the way through. And sometimes I wonder, for example, I can remember the three guys that I hung out with when I was in 8th grade. And I always wonder, what's Bernie doing? What's Jimmy Shepard doing? So yeah, I think about it now. High school is a little bit different because I'm still in touch with some of those folks. I think that happens with high school kids because everybody goes, well, not everybody, but lots of people go off to college.
Great. So, did you have a role model growing up as a kid? Anybody that you looked up to?
You're going back to your last question about transitions. If you're moving all the time, then the constant that you have is your family. So, and my dad's dad had died before I was born. So I knew my mom's dad. So I would have to say, as far as role models, male role models, it'd be my dad and my maternal grandfather. Other than that, you're going to have sports figures, you're going to have political figures. So my dad was a huge fan of Winston Churchill, so but he wasn't really a role model, it was just somebody that I admired. I think when it comes to role models, it was my parents and my grandparents.
Said this earlier, but what role did you play as the biggest or oldest of 5 kids? How did being the oldest, how was that different, or how did that affect you?
Well, I think, and partly verify it by conversations with my sisters. Parents in those days, in the 50s and 60s, they were going to be stricter on the oldest, and they were going to be stricter with a son. And so for me, being the oldest and a boy, followed by 3 sisters, I think just the way in which I was raised was more strict than the way in which my sisters were raised. And nobody minded. I mean, that's just the way in which it was. I think for whatever reasons, my parents expected an awful lot of me. So if they were going to expect a lot of me, they were also going to help me a lot. So it was not at all unusual for them to, for example, when it came to history and pulling out the Encyclopedia Britannica and going through things that I had questions about or was studying, that was to be expected. But whenever anything went wrong, whenever the parents knew that somebody had done something they weren't supposed to do and they weren't sure which one had done it, it was pretty much assumed that it was me.
Yeah.
And that was usually accurate. Yeah, because my sisters were, they had their own little battles, but for the most part, they were pretty well behaved.
Are there any quirky or unique qualities about your siblings? Anything, especially when they were younger? What's their uniqueness? How are they all different?
Well, I think they're all, they were all different. I had this sense of humor that probably came to me from my father that is just odd, making connections and seeing something funny about connections that are sometimes pretty obscure. My sister Ann had a great sense of humor, but it wasn't anything like that. And she also was kind of a dreamer. My sister Kathy was much more of a realist and in the world, and just loved having a little sister to lord it over. So her relationship with Karen was always a little cantankerous. And then Karen, having had to deal with a sister a couple of years older than her that was sometimes a little bossy, when her younger brother showed up, rather than being bossy towards him, they got to be like the best of friends. In fact, we used to sit around the dinner table, and every once in a while, all of the rest of us, the two older sisters and me and my parents, we just kind of looked out at the end of the table, and Karen and Tom would just be chatting away. They were in their own little world. So that was kind of an amusing way of seeing how people deal, how siblings deal with each other.
A question that probably pertains to more recent events. How did the death of Kathy affect you, and maybe how do you perceive it affected the rest of the siblings?
Well, when she got sick, there'd been a long period of estrangement between her and Anne. And, you know, it was kind of one of those things where there wasn't anything evil going either way. It was just, they were almost humorous about how they didn't deal with each other. When you were talking to them, I'm not sure that I could describe it, but when Kathy got sick, Anne was there in a heartbeat. It's not just Anne's nature, but she was everything that you would want for a big sister to be when, you know, when Kathy was sick. And Karen had always stayed in touch with Kathy, so, you know, Kathy had this great support from both of her sisters. And I suspect Tom would have been the same way if he were around, but it just so happened that Karen and Anne were they were in the same town, and Tom's thousands of miles away. How it affected me was that I had a hard time believing that it was actually happening. I've always been a bit of an optimist, so it was, well, of course she's sick, of course she's got cancer, but come on, she's gonna get over it, you know, something will work out. So that was a place where I kind of retreated, was everything's gonna be okay. You know, in a sense, I was saying, you know, this is probably good that it's brought Anne and Kathy closer together. And then in the back of my mind, which I think happens anytime you lose somebody, you just regret not having reached out more, not having spent more time with them, not having called her more often on the phone, or done more things with her. And again, just my nature, I'm not gonna wallow in that too much. Instead, I'm gonna kind of concentrate on the times that we did have together that were pretty good fun. And by that I mean the times as an adult, you know, when she and I would do things together.
Okay. Different question. About your parents. I asked you earlier what your parents were like. And my question is similar, but what was unique about each of them? What was quirky? Like, I think about some of the stories you tell me about the Maribi nature, or your dad and his car and going Christmas shopping. What was some quirky stories, or?
And one of the things that I didn't mention, but hinted at, was how he became different once he got out of the military, and how actually my sisters and I have sometimes talked about what is it that triggered that. You know, he had been, for most of his career in the military, he'd been an important guy. He was the base staff certificate and advising the base commanders and advising generals and having a whole bunch of younger lawyers or lower ranking lawyers underneath him. So it was a prestigious position. And then, you know, we kind of wonder how going into practice in a law firm where it's basically him and sometimes another younger lawyer, but it's just a different situation. You're doing more on your own, and you're not the most important lawyer on the base any longer. So that, and probably an addictive personality all along, turned him into an alcoholic. I think, not turned him into, just came to the forefront that he was an alcoholic. So that affected how he raised, or what was the home life for, mostly for Karen and Tom, a little bit for Kathy. I saw a completely different kind of a guy the last 20 years of his life. My mom, as you alluded to, the Marie B. Kind of picture. So the Marie that I described growing up, where I talked about how smart she was and how helpful she was with studies and everything, it's still the same personality. It's still a person who was not real centered on any one important thing. For Marie, and her maiden name was Burns, so it was always Marie B. For Marie B, life was good and nothing bothered her very much, and so whatever is going on, she was enjoying it, and she was, if the ham and scallop potatoes got burned, oh well, gosh, that's a shame. And as she got older and had to, kind of live in a house with a guy who had a drinking problem, it was the same personality. Oh gosh, oh Bill, and it carried over. It almost magnified, and it'd be the same thing, with her kids, even her grown kids. If I had, or she had heard that I had done something stupid, she'd be, oh, that boy, So it sounds like what I'm saying is somebody that wasn't very serious about things, but it's not that she wasn't serious. It's just that she had a real forgiving, open, and kind of loving personality. So she wasn't going to get worked up over a whole lot. And in the middle of it all, she'd get distracted by things. So nowadays, folks know about ADD a lot more than they knew in the 40s and 50s and 60s. So I think my mother was, as smart as she was pretty easily distracted by almost anything. I mean, I can imagine that she might be ironing a shirt and one of the kids would ask her a question and, well, you'd have to get another shirt.
That's
So,
great.
yeah.
Okay, last question. What got you into rugby, and at what age were you when you got into rugby? Tell us how you got into rugby.
Okay. So, when I grew up, there wasn't this emphasis on sports for kids. How Kevin did the competitive soccer, and it was a major part of his life. When I grew up, it was whatever was the sport of the season, you'd play it if you wanted to. Nobody got pushed into sports. So, you might play basketball with your friends, you might play, touch football, you might do almost any kind of sport. So what happened is you kind of developed a different athletic skills for different sports. Then when I got to college, I played a little bit of football, a little bit of intramural football, and I played basketball all the time at the gym, and ran, and got a lacrosse stick one summer to see if I could figure out how to use that. So again, it's just there wasn't any giant emphasis on any particular sport. And when I showed up at law school, I think it was my second year in law school, they were starting
a restarting a soccer team or a rugby team at the college. And I had a buddy who had gone to Notre Dame with me, said, well, let's go do that. So as soon as I discovered this sport that has, you can use every athletic skill, it's like in basketball, if you can't shoot, forget it. If you're not tall, forget it. In football, if you're not strong and can handle a concussion, forget it. In baseball, if you don't have good eye-hand coordination, you're never going to hit the ball. So rugby's kind of one of these sports where if you're halfway decent at all of those things, if you're halfway fast, if you're halfway good in your endurance, if you're halfway good at tackling people, if you're halfway good at kicking the ball, if you're halfway good at jumping, throwing, then it's a perfect sport because you do all of those things. So I just, almost instantly when I got out there, I said, this is just a great sport. Particularly because, just take tackling. So in football, because yardage is so important, you have to stop people dead in their tracks, which causes a lot of concussions and it's hard. And you get a little scared sometimes, trying to stop some big guy dead in his tracks. In rugby, you don't worry about it. You just have to tackle them, but if they pick up another 8 or 10 yards, you don't care. Doesn't matter in the game. You just can hang on, and eventually they go down, and you're happy. And you've done well. So, tackling was fun. Getting to actually throw the ball around was fun. In football, you're either tackling, or you're throwing the ball, or you're catching the ball, but you have assigned tasks. In rugby, you get to do it all. So I just stumbled very late in life, I was like 21, onto a sport that was just perfect for me.
And you were also in charge of dragging other guys into...
Well, yeah, because when I was, my last year in law school, I'd gotten a job at one of the fraternity houses that was, the real property was owned by the school, and they were on probation. And so I was kind of the house mother. And one of the ways in which I got them off probation was to keep them from having drinking parties and instead have them play rugby and then have their drinking parties. So yeah, I talked a bunch of the undergraduates that were in this fraternity house into playing rugby, and several of them were still playing like 20 years later. So that was pretty good.
That's right. Thanks.
Certainly. Thank you, ladies.